Before Lee Van Cleef became one of the most unforgettable faces in movie history, the cold-eyed villain who seemed to belong in the shadows of every Western, he was just a boy from a small town. Born in Somerville, New Jersey, Van Cleef didn't grow up in Hollywood or dream of fame right away. His father was a watchmaker, and that quiet, detailed work left its mark on young Lee. He learned discipline and precision early, qualities that would later shape his acting style. When World War II broke out, Van Cleef didn't hesitate to serve. He joined the U.S. Navy and worked as a sonar operator, a demanding and dangerous job that required absolute focus. Those years at war hardened him and gave him an edge that stayed with him long after he left the military. He didn't talk much about those experiences, but when he finally appeared on screen, that hard-earned toughness was easy to see in every glance and gesture. After the war, Van Cleef returned home and tried to follow a steady path. He enrolled at the University of South Carolina, studying engineering, aiming for a quiet and reliable future. But fate had other plans. Somewhere along the way, Hollywood called to him. His striking looks, sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, caught attention, and soon he packed his bags and moved west to try his luck in the film industry. At first, his career wasn't glamorous. Far from it. Van Cleef spent years stuck in small, forgettable roles. He played background thugs, henchmen who never spoke, outlaws without names. The camera loved his face, but directors didn't give him much to say or do. His characters often died quickly or simply blended into the background. Audiences recognized him, but didn't know his name. That period was frustrating for Van Cleef. He was a serious man who wanted to be taken seriously as an actor. Yet, Hollywood couldn't seem to see him as anything more than a menacing figure in the background. But even during these hard times, Van Cleef was quietly building something important. He was learning how to act without speaking much, how to use a single look, a simple gesture, to make a big impact. His icy stare, calm posture, and careful movements gave him a quiet power on screen. Directors might have ignored him at first, but audiences couldn't help but notice that intimidating presence. Little did anyone know, this silent supporting actor would soon become a major figure in cinema, a man whose stare alone could steal a scene. The frustrations of these early years, combined with the discipline he learned from his father and the toughness earned in war, were all shaping him for what would come next. His rise to fame was still ahead, but when it came, it would change everything. For years, Lee Van Cleef had been one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces that no one could name. He was always there, in the shadows, on the edges of the frame, playing outlaws and hired guns who said very little but always looked dangerous. His cold stare and sharp features made him the perfect villain, but the roles were small and forgettable. Directors typecast him as the bad guy, and it seemed that's all his career would ever amount to. But then everything changed, and it changed in a way Van Cleef never expected. Across the Atlantic, Italian director Sergio Leone was working on a new kind of Western. His films would be different from the old Hollywood Westerns. They would be rougher, darker, and grittier. Leone was searching for actors who looked real, tough men with rugged faces who could project menace without needing to say much. When he saw Lee Van Cleef, he knew he had found exactly what he was looking for. Leone cast Van Cleef in For a Few Dollars More, 1965, as Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a clever and deadly bounty hunter. It was Van Cleef's first real starring role, and he made the most of it. His performance was calm, sharp, and powerful. He wasn't just playing a typical villain. He brought a quiet intelligence to the character that made him fascinating to watch. Audiences couldn't take their eyes off him, but it was his next role that would make him unforgettable. In 1966, Leone cast Van Cleef as Angel Eyes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This role defined his career. As Angel Eyes, Van Cleef didn't need to shout or gesture wildly to seem dangerous. Every look he gave was cold and calculated, every movement slow and precise. He made audiences feel tension without saying a word. His villain felt real, deadly, and intelligent, not just evil for the sake of being evil. While Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name became the symbol of the spaghetti western antihero, it was Van Cleef's performance that truly haunted viewers. Angel Eyes wasn't loud or over the top. He was quiet, patient, and terrifying because he felt believable. His cold-blooded ruthlessness made the film even more intense. Almost overnight, Lee Van Cleef went from a forgotten supporting actor to a star. The spaghetti western audience in Europe embraced him. His face, sharp, weathered, and full of menace, became iconic. He was no longer just a background figure. He was now a leading man, commanding the screen in ways Hollywood had never allowed him to before. This breakthrough didn't just rescue his career. It gave him a whole new identity as a cult legend. And while he enjoyed the success, it also unlocked something darker inside him. Old frustrations, resentments, and a simmering grudge that would soon boil over, especially when it came to a man he couldn't stand, John Wayne. Even as Lee Van Cleef was becoming a star in Europe, there was a shadow hanging over him, and that shadow had a name, John Wayne. The two men had never worked together on screen, but their reputations often crossed paths. Both were known for westerns. Both had a strong, commanding presence. But beneath the surface, there was a tension between them that many in Hollywood quietly talked about. For Van Cleef, it wasn't just professional rivalry. He reportedly felt a deep dislike for Wayne, a dislike that ran far beyond their roles in films. Part of it was about acting itself. Van Cleef took his craft seriously. He was disciplined and precise, always thinking carefully about how to play his characters. His villains weren't cartoonish or exaggerated. They were quiet, dangerous, and complex. He believed in subtlety and depth. John Wayne was different. Wayne played the same kind of character again and again. The tough, patriotic cowboy who stood for old-fashioned American values. His style was big and straightforward, and he didn't seem interested in subtlety. To millions of moviegoers, Wayne was a hero. But to Van Cleef, Wayne's performances lacked depth and honesty. He saw Wayne as an actor who relied too much on his image and too little on his craft. But the differences between them weren't just about acting styles. Politics played a role too. John Wayne was known for his loud, conservative views. He proudly supported American nationalism, backed the Vietnam War, and often spoke about patriotism and military strength. Van Cleef, though more private about his opinions, reportedly leaned the other way. He didn't care for Hollywood's flag-waving or its obsession with American heroism. To him, Wayne's politics seemed arrogant and old-fashioned, a reflection of an establishment that Van Cleef quietly rejected. Professional jealousy may have made things even worse. John Wayne had achieved stardom early, dominating Hollywood's box office for decades. Van Cleef, on the other hand, had struggled in small roles for years before finally finding success in Europe. Even after his breakthrough in the good, the bad, and the ugly, Van Cleef's fame didn't reach the same level as Wayne's back home. That must have stung, and insiders say it added fuel to his resentment. When their paths crossed at Hollywood events or parties, things didn't improve. Wayne was said to dismiss Van Cleef as just another character actor, someone who could play a villain but could never be a true leading man like himself. To Van Cleef, this was deeply insulting. He knew the kind of work he put into his roles, and he felt Wayne didn't respect that. Their feud never exploded publicly. They never traded insults in interviews, and they never worked together. But behind the scenes, their dislike for one another was well known. For Lee Van Cleef, this personal grudge became part of what fueled his cold, steely presence on screen. And in a way, that private tension helped define his legacy as much as any role he played. After his breakout performances in Sergio Leone's films, Lee Van Cleef was no longer just another villain on the sidelines. In Europe, he became a major star. Directors couldn't get enough of him. Audiences were captivated by his unique presence, that icy glare, the quiet danger in every movement, the feeling that he was always one step ahead of everyone else. But Van Cleef didn't play ordinary bad guys. He brought something deeper to his characters. His roles in films like The Big Gun Down, 1966, Death Rides a Horse, 1967, and Day of Anger, 1967, showed that he wasn't interested in playing flat, one-dimensional villains. Instead, he portrayed characters who lived in the gray areas between good and evil. These were men shaped by hard lives, haunted by past mistakes, who followed their own strict codes of honor, even if that code meant violence. In The Big Gun Down, Van Cleef played a relentless bounty hunter, chasing a fugitive across Mexico. The story wasn't simple. His character wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, nor was he a pure villain. He was something more interesting, a man driven by duty and shaped by a harsh world. That balance of danger and depth became Van Cleef's signature. This was a new kind of Western, darker, grittier, more honest. Gone were the clean-cut cowboys in white hats. Van Cleef's characters operated in the shadows, in a world full of moral compromise. He gave audiences something they hadn't seen before, a gunfighter who was both elegant and dangerous, weary yet ruthless. Even as his characters grew more complex, Van Cleef's style stayed the same, quiet, precise, and disciplined. He didn't waste words. Every glance, every step, every pause mattered. His silence often spoke louder than dialogue. Directors praised him for knowing exactly when to hold back, how to let a scene breathe, and how to build tension without saying a thing. This ability set him apart from other actors in the genre, including John Wayne. Where Wayne often played loud, larger-than-life heroes, Van Cleef's characters were reserved and unpredictable. You never quite knew what they were thinking, and that made them fascinating. By the late 1960s, Van Cleef was one of the biggest names in the spaghetti western world. His face, lined, weathered, and sharp, was instantly recognizable. In posters and trailers, his piercing gaze became a symbol of danger and mystery. But just as his star reached its peak, a shift was coming. The popularity of spaghetti westerns was starting to fade, and the movie industry was changing. For Van Cleef, this meant that if he wanted to keep working, he would have to adapt once again. And as he prepared for that next chapter, his determination and toughness, the same traits that made him a star, would be tested in new and unexpected ways. By the early 1970s, the golden era of spaghetti westerns was beginning to wane. Audiences were moving on, and the genre that had made Lee Van Cleef a star was slowly fading from cinema screens. For many actors who had found success in westerns, this would have been the beginning of the end. But Van Cleef wasn't about to let his career slip away so easily. Even though he was closely associated with westerns, Van Cleef understood that if he wanted to keep working, he would have to adapt. His face was known all over Europe, but he wanted to stay relevant back home too. Even his tastes changed and new types of films became popular. Fortunately, his quiet intensity and commanding presence worked just as well in other genres. In the 1980 film The Octagon, Van Cleef teamed up with martial arts star Chuck Norris. The movie blended East meets West action and proved that Van Cleef could hold his own in fight scenes even as he got older. His steely glare and calm authority gave the film weight, and it helped introduce him to a new generation of action fans. Then, in 1981, he appeared in John Carpenter's Escape from New York. Cast as the tough, no-nonsense Commissioner Bob Hawke, Van Cleef brought his trademark cold-eyed authority to the role. Even though he wasn't the lead, he stood out. His scenes opposite Kurt Russell's antihero, Snake Plissken, crackled with tension. Once again, Van Cleef showed that he could make a lasting impression with just a few words and a quiet, dangerous energy. Television came calling next. In 1984, Van Cleef starred in The Master, a short-lived series where he played an aging martial arts expert training a younger protege. The show only lasted one season, but it showed that Van Cleef was willing to take risks and keep moving forward. It also introduced him to a wider audience who might never have seen his Western films. Throughout all of these changes, Van Cleef never softened his screen persona. He stayed true to what made him unique, that mix of quiet menace, discipline, and mystery. Even as he aged, his performances remained sharp and focused. He insisted on doing his own action scenes whenever possible, refusing to let his advancing years define him or hold him back. His work ethic became legendary among younger actors who worked with him. Many said he was generous with advice, sharing tips on how to hold back in a scene and let tension build naturally, a lesson he had mastered over decades. For Van Cleef, this period wasn't just about finding work, it was about proving something. He had fought too hard to be seen as more than a background villain, and he wasn't going to give up his place now. He was determined to remain a force on screen, no matter what kind of film or show it was. Even as Lee Van Cleef became a cult legend on screen, his personal life was far more complicated than the steely characters he played. Behind the cold stare and quiet menace was a man who had faced real hardships, personal struggles, and lasting scars, both emotional and physical. Van Cleef was married 3 times, and each relationship reflected the challenges of a life spent in Hollywood and far from home. His first marriage, to Patty Ruth Cale, lasted 15 years and gave him 3 children. But the long hours, constant travel, and frustrations of an acting career strained their relationship. As Van Cleef worked tirelessly to establish himself, the marriage slowly fell apart. His second marriage, to Joan Marjorie Drew, began during a critical point in his career, right around the time Sergio Leone's films were changing his fortunes. For 14 years, she stood beside him as he transitioned from overlooked character actor to international star. But fame brought its own pressures, and that relationship too eventually ended in divorce in 1974. Finally, in 1976, Van Cleef married Barbara Havlone, his third and final wife. This marriage brought much-needed stability during the later years of his life. Barbara was by his side through health challenges and the natural slowing down that came with age. Despite all the ups and downs, she remained with him until the end. Van Cleef's personal life also carried physical scars that many people never knew about. In the late 1950s, before his breakout roles, Van Cleef was in a serious car accident. The crash shattered his knee, broke several bones, and left doctors questioning whether he would ever walk normally again, much less ride a horse or perform action scenes in westerns. For an actor whose career depended on physical presence, this was nearly a career-ending event. But Van Cleef didn't give up. With quiet determination, he went through long and painful rehabilitation. When he returned to acting, he carried those injuries with him, literally. He had a distinct limp for the rest of his life, but rather than hide it, he used it to add weight to his characters. His stiff, careful walk became part of his on-screen identity, adding even more authenticity to the weathered gunfighters he portrayed. There was another physical reminder of his toughness as well, the missing tip of his right-hand middle finger. He had accidentally severed it while building a playhouse for his daughter Deborah. For most actors, such a visible injury might have been a problem, but Van Cleef simply worked around it. Most audiences never noticed, but for those who knew, it became a symbol of his resilience and quiet devotion as a father. Through it all, Van Cleef kept working, kept pushing, and kept proving that he was more than just a tough face on a movie poster. He was a man shaped by hardship, discipline, and an unbreakable will. By the 1980s, Lee Van Cleef was in the later stages of his career. The roles were changing, and so was the film industry itself. The spaghetti western, which had defined him, was no longer in fashion, and Hollywood was embracing a new kind of blockbuster. But Van Cleef wasn't ready to fade into the background. Instead, he adapted, not just as an actor, but as a mentor to a younger generation of performers. On sets like The Master, where he played a wise, aging martial arts expert guiding a younger protege, Van Cleef's role behind the scenes often mirrored his role on screen. He became a teacher, sharing what he had learned during decades in a tough and often unforgiving business. Actors who worked with him described him as quiet but generous, always willing to help them understand how to build tension without overacting. He taught them that a single glance could say more than a speech, that restraint could be more powerful than theatrics. He had mastered the art of understatement, and he encouraged others to learn that skill too. But while he gave freely of his experience, Van Cleef was also fighting his own private battles. Years of physical punishment, from his wartime service to the brutal car accident that nearly ended his career, had taken a toll. He suffered from chronic pain and a heart condition that forced him to slow down, though he refused to let it stop him completely. Even as his body aged, his mind remained sharp and his on-screen intensity never wavered. Van Cleef insisted on doing many of his own action scenes whenever possible, even though stunt doubles were available. For him, it wasn't just about pride. It was about authenticity. He wanted audiences to believe what they were seeing, and he wanted his characters to feel real, no matter the cost to himself. His work ethic earned him deep respect from directors and castmates alike. Even though he wasn't the biggest Hollywood star and never reached John Wayne's level of fame, Van Cleef was seen as a true professional, someone who took the craft seriously and worked harder than anyone else on set. At the same time, Van Cleef maintained his quiet, steely screen persona right up until the end of his life. He continued to choose roles that suited his image. The dangerous, disciplined figure who carried an air of mystery and experience. And with every new project, he proved that his talent wasn't tied to any one genre. For Van Cleef, it wasn't about chasing stardom or being a celebrity. It was about the work itself, perfecting his craft, creating characters that felt authentic, and doing justice to every scene he was in. But even as he pushed forward, time was catching up with him. His body was slowing down, his health was declining, and soon, the final chapter of his life would begin. As Lee Van Cleef entered the final years of his life, he remained much the same man he had always been, disciplined, serious, and quietly determined. While some actors softened as they aged, Van Cleef never lost the edge that made him unique. He continued to work whenever he could, taking roles that allowed him to project the quiet menace and authority that had defined his entire career. But away from the camera, his body was showing signs of wear. The injuries from his earlier years never fully healed, and his heart condition worsened. He moved more slowly, but he was still willing to appear on screen when called, refusing to let health troubles define him or his legacy. Despite decades of work, Van Cleef never quite achieved the same level of fame in America as he did overseas. In Europe, particularly Italy, he was regarded as a cinematic icon, a man who helped redefine what a Western hero or anti-hero could be. In the United States, though, he was often still seen as a character actor, the villain with the cold stare. That gap between his international fame and his Hollywood reputation reflected the uphill battle he had fought for most of his life. Even so, Van Cleef wasn't bitter. He knew he had made a lasting impact. He had built a reputation not by chasing fame, but by dedicating himself to his craft, earning respect from filmmakers, actors, and audiences who appreciated subtlety and authenticity. His rumored feud with John Wayne remained part of his legend. While they never shared a scene on screen, stories of their mutual dislike continued to circulate in Hollywood circles. Whether driven by differences in politics, acting style, or simply personality, their cold relationship reflected more than personal grudges. It symbolized two very different views of the Western genre itself. Where Wayne represented the clean-cut, heroic cowboy, Van Cleef embodied the grittier, morally complex antihero, a man shaped by hardship and capable of both ruthlessness and surprising depth. On December 16, 1989, Lee Van Cleef died at his home in Oxnard, California, at the age of 64. The cause was a heart attack, complicated by the long-standing injuries that had plagued him for years. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in Hollywood Hills, beneath a simple headstone that read, "Best of the Bad." That phrase summed up his legacy perfectly. Van Cleef wasn't just another villain. He was the villain audiences remembered, the one whose quiet stare and cold precision made every scene more intense. He redefined what it meant to be a screen outlaw. Not loud, not cartoonish, but real and deeply human. Today, decades after his passing, Lee Van Cleef's performances continue to captivate audiences around the world. His face, lined and weathered, still appears on posters and in film retrospectives. His characters, full of danger, mystery, and quiet complexity, continue to influence modern actors and filmmakers who recognize his mastery of understatement and tension. In the end, Van Cleef proved that you don't have to play the hero to leave a lasting mark. Sometimes the quiet, calculating man in the shadows becomes the one audiences never forget.